In a world where everyone seems to be shouting for attention, what if the greatest burdens are carried by those who whisper? Imagine a quiet diner not just serving food, but offering a sanctuary from the storm, a place where a worn-out heart finds a home and a lost child finds a family. This is the story of Maria, a woman who channeled her grief into serving her small community, and Ben, a thin 9-year-old boy with eyes that hold a lifetime of unspoken stories. He sits alone, never ordering, just watching the world outside as if waiting for a signal only he can see. But when the world finally comes for him, it's not a storm. It's a squad of men in crisp uniforms and a secret that will change Maria's life forever. Maria, Carter's Maple and Soul Diner, stood as a steadfast haven in the heart of a small Midwestern town, much like its owner, 48-year-old Maria Carter. The place was more than just a diner. It was a lifeline, offering warmth, comfort, and food to the local community. For Maria, it was the only thing that kept her going after the loss of her husband, a Marine who passed away at 39 after battling cancer. It had been 9 years, but the pain of losing him had never fully faded. Instead, Maria channeled her grief into the care of her small diner, a place that served more than just meals. It served as a sanctuary. Every morning for almost 3 weeks, a boy would come to the diner. He was thin, no older than 9, with dark, solemn eyes and clothes that looked too worn for his young age. He would always sit quietly at the corner booth by the window, never ordering anything, never making a fuss, just sitting. His presence seemed to take up no space, as though he didn't want to draw attention to himself. Maria noticed him right away. The first time she saw him, she approached him with a coffee pot in hand, wiping her hands on the apron she wore, the flour from the morning biscuits still dusting its fabric. "Waiting for someone?" she asked gently. The boy didn't answer at first, his gaze focused downward, his fingers tracing invisible lines on the tabletop. She tried again. "Cold?" she asked, noticing the way he huddled into his threadbare hoodie, trying to keep warm. "A little," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of things he hadn't said aloud. There was something in that soft admission that tugged at Maria's heart, stirring a memory of her own tough nights when food was scarce, when a kind word or unexpected gesture had meant the world. Without another word, Maria returned with steaming chicken soup and a glass of milk. "I don't have any money," the boy said, finally looking up, his eyes too old for his young face. Maria smiled gently, her hand briefly resting on his shoulder. "Neither did I," she said softly, her voice a quiet reminder of how far kindness could stretch. From that moment on, an unspoken understanding formed between them. The boy, whom Maria called Ben, though he never confirmed it, would show up at 7 a.m. each morning, take his place at the corner booth, and remain there for exactly 2 hours. Maria would serve him breakfast, no fanfare, always something different, always warm. He would eat it slowly, taking measured bites, never rushing. As time passed, however, not everyone was as comfortable with this new routine. The regulars began to notice, and some were not shy about voicing their opinions. "That kid sits like a ghost in the corner," Dave, a Thursday regular, grumbled one day, casting a glance toward the boy. "Just staring out the window, all creepy-like." Linda from the beauty salon was even more direct. "Street kids are like strays," she said, shaking her head. "Feed them once and they never leave. Next thing you know, they're bringing their friends, stealing silverware." Even Hank, the most loyal of regulars, voiced his concerns. "Not good for business," he muttered, glancing at the corner where Ben sat. "Having some ragamuffin in here taking up space. People will start thinking this place is a shelter." Maria, however, wasn't swayed by the complaints. She continued to wipe down the counter, her movements calm and deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm, carrying a strength that had been forged through years of hardship. "Not everyone who sits quietly is a burden," she said, her gaze flicking briefly to Ben. "Some people just need a place to exist." Ben, for his part, didn't seem to mind the murmurs of the diner's regulars. His attention was often caught by the small things, like the cardinal that had landed on the windowsill one morning. For a fleeting moment, Maria saw something she hadn't seen before, a ghost of a smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tiny flicker of the childhood that Ben had surely lost long ago, a sign that despite everything that had hardened him, A part of him still longed for the innocence of youth. The cardinal flew off, and the smile faded just as quickly, but Maria had seen it, and that, she thought, was enough. In a world that often seemed devoid of kindness, Maria's simple act of offering a boy a place to sit without asking for anything in return made all the difference. Fridays were always busy at Maple and Soul, with the weekend rush drawing in all kinds of customers. Business people would stop by for a final treat before the work week ended, retirees would gather for their standing breakfast club, and locals would swing by to grab their morning coffee before heading to work. But this particular Friday, the rain battered the windows in a relentless storm, making the diner feel even more like a refuge from the world outside. The diner's warmth was a stark contrast to the downpour outside, its cozy, familiar atmosphere providing refuge for anyone seeking shelter. By 9:00 a.m., every table was taken, save for one, the corner booth where Ben sat alone. His small figure seemed to shrink even further against the backdrop of the foggy windows. His posture was slumped, shoulders hunched inward, as if trying to make himself as invisible as possible. Despite the clatter and noise of the busy diner around him, he remained eerily still, a quiet island amid the cacophony. The bell above the door jingled as a man in a sharp charcoal suit entered, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. He was in his late 40s with an air of confidence, followed by three colleagues who were similarly well-dressed, their attire signaling they were from out of town, likely from the new corporate offices downtown. The man surveyed the diner with the kind of gaze reserved for those accustomed to having space made for them. Maria, moving gracefully from the kitchen with a coffee pot in hand, greeted them warmly. "Morning, folks. Tight quarters today, but there's a table opening up in about 5 minutes." The man nodded dismissively, his attention already scanning the room. But when his eyes landed on Ben's booth, something in his expression shifted. He frowned, his gaze narrowing as he took in the boy's worn clothes and the solitary glass of milk before him. "What about that table?" he asked, his voice slightly raised as he pointed to Ben. "There's a kid sitting there, taking up an entire booth." Maria's smile remained in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That seat's taken," she replied smoothly, her tone firm but friendly. The man raised an eyebrow. "Taken?" he echoed, his gaze flicking between Ben and Maria. "By what exactly?" "A paying customer," Maria answered unfazed. The hum of the diner seemed to quiet, conversations dipping as everyone in the room became subtly aware of the exchange. Maria, with quiet precision, poured coffee for a nearby table before returning to the conversation. "He's a regular," she added simply, her voice unhurried. The suited man's bark of laughter sliced through the air, cutting into the warmth of the diner. "Regular?" he scoffed. "Not ordering anything, not paying a dime, just sitting there staring out the window. And you call that a regular?" Ben's fingers tightened around the glass of milk in front of him, his knuckles turning white. His eyes remained fixed on the tabletop, but his posture, tense and rigid, spoke volumes. He heard every word, each one like a dagger, but he didn't move, didn't look up. The suited man turned to his colleagues with a disdainful shake of his head. "This kid's clearly some street urchin, and they're letting him take up valuable space." He scoffed again. "Management's gone soft these days." His voice rose in a self-important sneer. The entire diner fell into a heavy silence. Several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting glances between Ben, the suited man, and Maria. Others stared at their plates, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. No one spoke up. "I don't feel comfortable eating next to vagrant children," the man continued, his voice now rising with indignation. "Make him leave so paying customers can have that table." Maria's movements were deliberate as she set the coffee pot down. When she spoke, her voice held a warmth that somehow made the steel edge of her words even sharper. "Sir, if you can't enjoy your breakfast with a quiet child nearby, you're welcome to take your meal to go." The man's face flushed with anger. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, his voice now booming across the diner. "I could buy this whole building if I wanted to." Maria didn't flinch. "The building? Maybe," she replied coolly, her gaze steady. "But not what happens inside these walls." A few customers, clearly uncomfortable, suddenly stood and decided to pay their bills. The sound of shuffling feet added to the tension in the air. Some murmured disapproval, not of the man's behavior, but of Maria's refusal to back down. In the end, the suited man and his colleagues reluctantly took a table on the far side of the diner, their dissatisfaction palpable in the cold air around them. By noon, a young mother entered with her daughter, who appeared to be about 6 years old. They were seated at the table next to Ben's booth. The little girl, full of innocent curiosity, smiled at Ben, who, for the first time that morning, returned a hesitant, half-smile. It was the most interaction Maria had ever seen him attempt, though it was small, almost imperceptible. But within moments, the mother noticed her daughter's interest in the silent boy. She leaned in and whispered something in her daughter's ear before pulling her chair away from Ben's vicinity. "Let's sit over here instead, sweetie," she said, just loud enough for Ben to hear, and "stay away from kids like that." Ben's face remained an impassive mask, but Maria saw the subtle shift in his posture, how his shoulders curled in even further, as if trying to disappear entirely. It was an almost imperceptible change, but it was there, telling the story of a child who had long since learned to withdraw in the face of rejection. Maria's heart tightened, though it was not loud. It was the kind of break that occurred in silence, the kind of rupture that doesn't announce itself but simply exists. She set the plate she was holding down on a nearby counter, and without a word made her way over to Ben's table. The others in the diner watched in quiet curiosity, sensing something unusual. This time, instead of simply refilling his coffee or dropping off a plate, Maria slid into the booth opposite him. Ben's eyes snapped up in surprise, his face etched with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion, like someone caught between the weight of the world and the need to hold themselves upright. "You know what, Ben?" she said softly, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made it feel like more than just words. "In here, you're still a person. You always will be." She didn't say more. There was no need to. The diner fell into a moment of shared silence, unspoken understanding hanging in the air. She, a woman who had lost so much, yet still capable of kindness in a world that seemed devoid of it, and he, a young man who seemed to have lost everything but his dignity. That night, after the last of the diner's patrons had left, Maria counted the receipts, feeling the dull ache of the day's loss. A few regulars had walked out without ordering, and others had left smaller tips, a subtle but harsh measure of their disapproval. She closed the ledger with no real regret. Some things, after all, couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Some things had worth beyond what you could calculate on a balance sheet, things like the quiet dignity of a troubled soul. The morning after arrived with unrelenting rain, turning the world outside into a blur of grays and blues. Maria opened the diner a little earlier than usual, moving through the pre-dawn hours with the practiced precision of someone who had done the same thing for years. The scent of coffee brewing, bacon sizzling, and dough being kneaded into something comforting filled the space. These rituals had carried her through 9 long years of widowhood, providing a rhythm that helped her face the solitude of each passing day. At 6:45, 15 minutes before Ben's usual arrival, the door opened and he stepped in, drenched from the rain, water streaming off his hoodie. Maria unlocked the door quickly, her brow furrowing in concern. "You're early today, sweetheart. Everything okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but carrying an undercurrent of worry. Ben gave a slight nod, but something was different. He stood straighter, his posture more alert, as if he could sense a shift in the air, a change he wasn't quite ready for. When he pulled off his soaking hoodie, Maria noticed a layer underneath, something thicker, structured as though it was meant to hold weight, to provide support. It wasn't just for warmth. "Let me get you something hot," she said, trying to hide the worry that was creeping in. "Oatmeal with brown sugar today, or maybe eggs and toast?" Ben settled into his usual corner booth, but instead of slumping against the window like he normally did, he sat up, his small frame tense, as if something inside him had braced itself. "Anything is fine, ma'am. Thank you." Maria went about preparing his breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon apples and a side of toast, but the unsettling feeling in her chest only grew. She couldn't shake the sense that today was going to be different. As she placed the food in front of him, she caught him glancing frequently at the clock, then the window, then the door, his gaze restless, like a man waiting for something to happen. "Ben," she ventured carefully, her voice low, "if there's something wrong, you can tell me." Are you in some kind of trouble? His brown eyes, flecked with amber, met hers briefly before he turned his attention back to the window. No, ma'am, just waiting. For what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A small, cryptic smile played at the corner of his lips. For things to change. The morning passed and the usual patrons trickled in, shaking off umbrellas and stamping wet boots on the mat. A few glanced at Ben, their faces betraying the same mixture of indifference and lingering disapproval that had followed yesterday's confrontation. Maria couldn't help but notice the watch on his wrist, a surprisingly nice digital piece for a kid who couldn't even afford breakfast some days. At exactly 7:43 a.m., the soft hum of conversation in the diner was broken by the unmistakable sound of tires on wet asphalt. But this wasn't just another customer arriving. This was something deliberate. The sound of multiple vehicles synchronized in their approach. People turned, eyes widening as they looked out the windows. 4 black Escalades rolled into the parking lot, moving with military precision. They parked in a diamond formation, their tinted windows revealing nothing about the occupants. The air in the diner shifted, a palpable tension hanging over everything as the hum of conversation fell into an uneasy silence. Maria felt it too. Something was about to happen, something that couldn't be ignored. The hum of quiet conversation and clinking silverware had filled the diner until suddenly something shifted in the air. Hank, perched on his usual seat at the counter, furrowed his brow and muttered to himself, "What in the world?" His words hung in the air like an omen, just before the vehicle outside came to a halt, its engine cutting off with eerie precision. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The rain continued to fall steadily on the diner's roof, and the low murmur of the diner's patrons seemed suspended in time. Coffee cups hovered midway to lips, eyes flicking nervously toward the window, unsure of what was coming next. Then, as though rehearsed in perfect unison, all 4 doors on the driver's side swung open. The men who stepped out were the very definition of discipline, dressed in sharp, immaculate military uniforms. Their movements were synchronized and deliberate. They didn't display any rank insignia other than the small American flag patches on their arms, but it was clear to everyone watching that they were no ordinary soldiers. These men were special operations, their presence alone commanding a respect that left no room for doubt. They scanned the area with military precision, their eyes briefly sweeping over the diner before they began their march toward the entrance, their steps purposeful and unyielding. From the lead vehicle, a woman emerged last, her uniform equally pristine despite the pouring rain. As she spoke briefly into a wrist microphone, she seemed as much a part of the storm as she was of the quiet command that followed her every movement. The bell above the diner door jingled as they entered, and with them came an unmistakable aura of authority. Even the rain seemed to pause in its fall, as though the world had held its breath. The military personnel moved through the diner, their eyes scanning each face until they found the one they sought. Ben, still seated at his table, was their target. To the astonishment of everyone in the diner, the lead officer, without a moment's hesitation, dropped to one knee before him. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with disbelief. But Ben's response was quiet, direct, and firm. "Sir, we found you." The words, though soft, carried an undeniable weight, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Ben straightened, the fluidity of his movements almost deliberate. Slowly he removed his hoodie, pulling it over his head and revealing a black t-shirt. The emblem on the shirt was unfamiliar to Maria, a gold star encircled by laurel leaves with the words "Star Cadet Program" embroidered beneath it. The officer remained kneeling, eyes lowered, awaiting something, an approval perhaps. Ben nodded and the officer rose, stepping aside to let the lieutenant colonel approach. She didn't speak to Ben first, though. Her gaze shifted to Maria, and for the first time her expression softened. "Ma'am, thank you for protecting him," she said, her voice carrying a quiet gratitude. "This diner was our safest lead." Maria stood frozen, the coffee pot still in her hand, trying to grasp the situation unfolding in front of her. The familiar clink of silverware and hushed conversations around the room seemed miles away. Regular customers sat in stunned silence, some with wide eyes, others shrinking back into their booths as if trying to disappear into the walls. "I don't understand," Maria finally managed, her voice trembling slightly. Protected him from what? Who is he? Ben, now standing, his small frame seeming suddenly more imposing, took a deep breath. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, carrying a newfound confidence, as though he'd been waiting for this moment to finally come. "My name is Benjamin Boyd," he began, his eyes meeting Maria's for the first time with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I'm the son of Staff Sergeant Thomas Boyd. He was killed in action in Syria last year." The diner went deathly silent. Even the rain, it seemed, had paused, as if in respect. "I was placed in a foster home after my dad died," Ben continued, his voice unwavering, though Maria could hear the quiet ache beneath his words. "But there was a security breach. Someone targeted Gold Star families, children of fallen soldiers. They evacuated all of us from the program facilities." The lieutenant colonel nodded solemnly. "Benjamin was instructed to find a safe location away from his designated extraction point," she added, her voice calm but laced with concern. "We've been searching for him for 17 days. Maria, still trying to make sense of it all, spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "But why here? Why my diner?" Ben's composure faltered for a moment. His eyes grew distant, and Maria saw a flicker of something. Perhaps pain, perhaps nostalgia. "Dad always talked about a diner in his hometown," he said quietly. "A place where the owner was kind to him when he was young. He said if he was ever lost, I should find a place like that. Kind people, he said, are the best shelter in a storm." Maria's chest tightened. She had always known her diner was a place where people came to find solace, even if they never said so outright. How many had passed through these doors over the years? How many had she fed without ever knowing the weight they carried on their shoulders? Ben wasn't finished. He took another breath, as if gathering the strength to say what he hadn't shared until now. "There's something else," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Dad told me he lost something important here years ago. A lighter. It had his name on it. He said it was the last thing his father gave him before he deployed to Desert Storm." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. She had never shared this with anyone, but deep in the drawer beneath her cash register, there lay a Marine Corps lighter. She had never thought much of it, but now the weight of the moment was crashing down on her as the truth settled in. The storm outside raged on, but for a brief second, inside the diner, everything was still. Maria Carter had always held on to the lighter, an object she found years ago in the parking lot. It was an odd thing to keep, especially considering she wasn't sure why she had held onto it for so long. Perhaps it was the engraved initials, TB, that reminded her of her late husband. Maybe it was simply a relic of the past she couldn't quite bring herself to part with. Regardless, it had become a part of her life, tucked away, never truly forgotten. One quiet afternoon, she retrieved it from its place and approached Ben. Her hands shook as she held it out to him. Could this be your father's?" she asked, her voice uncertain but full of hope. Ben took the lighter from her, holding it in his hands like a fragile treasure. His face softened, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. A deep, quiet grief seemed to well up inside him. Then, for the first time in all the years she had known him, Ben's eyes filled with tears. The tears spilled over, tracing paths down his face as he clutched the lighter tightly to his chest. His shoulders trembled, and he silently sobbed, the weight of the moment too much to bear. The room was still. The military personnel, ever disciplined, stood at attention and raised their hands in a silent salute to the boy holding the legacy of his father in his hands. The moment transcended the diner, taking on a significance that no one present could fully understand. But it touched something deep inside them all. They watched, witnesses to something sacred, something human. By evening, the news had spread like wildfire through the small town. The story of the Gold Star boy and the military convoy had reached every corner of the community. In less than 24 hours, local news outlets had picked it up, and by Monday morning, a television crew had arrived, cameras in tow. Maria stood by, watching everything unfold with a quiet, almost stunned amazement. Her phone rang incessantly, reporters seeking statements, townspeople offering support, and even a documentary filmmaker inquiring about telling Ben's story. Inside the diner, the atmosphere shifted. The same customers who had once whispered behind Maria's back now approached her with expressions of regret and shame. Some came with flowers in hand, others left large tips with written apologies. and all of them asked about Ben. They wanted to know how he was holding up. The suited man who had arrived on Friday, the one who had caused such a stir, came back on Tuesday morning. His usual swagger was replaced by a rare hesitance. He placed an envelope on the counter without looking Maria in the eye. "For the boy's education," he muttered, his voice low. 3 years of private school tuition, prepaid. Before Maria could respond, he added quietly, almost to himself, "I have a son his age. I never really thought about what it's like for military kids, what they lose." Then the young mother who had rushed away with her daughter returned. Tears streamed down her face as she approached Maria, her guilt and sorrow evident. She hugged Maria tightly. "I was so wrong," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I forgot that kindness doesn't wear a uniform. Please, when you see him, will you tell him I'm sorry?" Maria didn't have the heart to tell her that Ben was no longer in town, that he was safely ensconced in a secure military facility with his whereabouts classified. Instead, she simply nodded and returned the hug, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy between them. By the end of the week, Maple and Soul had transformed. What was once a humble diner had become an impromptu memorial for fallen soldiers. Patrons began bringing in photographs of their loved ones who had served. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, siblings. Maria cleared a space on the wall near Ben's corner booth, where each photograph found a home. The images were accompanied by handwritten notes, brief yet poignant memories of lives given in service to the country. Local veterans began to gather in the mornings, forming a tight-knit group around a large table at the back of the diner. There was always an empty chair bent for those who had given their lives, those who couldn't join them. Sometimes they sat in silence, their unspoken understanding enough to fill the space. At other times, their laughter filled the room, bringing a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen ovens. A local carpenter had made a special marker for Ben's booth, a small unbreakable table sign carved from polished oak. It simply read, "Ben's Table." Beneath that, in smaller lettering, it said, "Reserved for those who wait in silence." And though no one ever sat there, Maria made sure the table remained clean and cared for, placing a fresh glass of milk there every morning, as though awaiting Ben's return. As for Maria, her routine remained unchanged. She still rose before the sun, kneaded dough, and brewed coffee. She still greeted each regular customer by name, remembered their usual orders, and offered extra whipped cream on the pie to anyone who seemed to need a little sweetness. But something had shifted inside her, something fundamental. It was as though the weight of the world had settled into her soul, the burdens of life, of loss, of love, all woven into her every action, her every thought. She no longer felt quite so alone. Maria Carter had always believed that her diner was more than just a place to grab a meal. It was her sanctuary, her space where she could hide from the world and protect herself from the shadows of her own grief. But when Ben entered her life, she realized that healing sometimes comes from unexpected places. By helping him, by creating a space where he could remain silent and deal with his own trauma, Maria found herself healing in ways she hadn't even known she needed. Ben, always a man of few words, carried burdens far heavier than anyone around him could understand. His silence, once a wall, now seemed like an invitation for her to understand the weight he was carrying. As she offered him a corner of her diner, a safe place where he could release that weight, something in her own heart began to shift. It was like the grief she'd buried deep inside it was suddenly allowed to breathe again, a breath she hadn't realized she was choking on for so long. She often told anyone who asked why she helped him, "The quietest people carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes all they need is a corner where they can set that weight down for a little while." For her, the diner was no longer just a job, it was a purpose. Months after the Escalades had settled into their new home, Lieutenant Colonel Winters came back to Maple and Soul alone. This time she wasn't in uniform, but she still carried the same air of authority. She ordered her usual, coffee and blueberry pie, and waited for the lunch rush to subside before approaching Maria with a folder that looked official enough to cause anyone to hold their breath. Ben had been placed with a military family in Virginia, Winters explained, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The family, retired General Matthews and his wife, had 3 other foster children from the Gold Star program, and they had offered Ben a permanent home. Maria smiled weakly. "That's wonderful," she said, though the hollow ache growing beneath her ribs told her otherwise. He deserved stability. But there was more. Winters hesitated, and Maria felt her heart pick up a beat. "Ben refused the placement," she said. "He said, 'I want to stay here.' This was the first place I wasn't afraid." Maria blinked, the surprise overtaking her calm facade. "What? Why?" "His exact words were written in the file," Winters said. "He asked for you specifically." She slid the folder across the counter, the papers barely making a sound as they landed in front of Maria. "These are guardianship papers. There's no obligation, but Ben, he wants you." Before the words even fully registered in her mind, Maria spoke without thinking. "Yes, I'll do it." The process was a whirlwind. Background checks, home inspections, interviews with social workers, military personnel. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her, especially since she was still running the diner alone. But after 6 weeks, Maria had transformed her spare room into a safe haven for Ben. She painted the walls blue, set a desk by the window, and made sure it felt like a place he could truly call his own. When Ben arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his few belongings were packed into a standard-issue duffel bag. He stood in the doorway of his new room, the familiar gold star emblem on his t-shirt glinting in the sunlight. His voice trembled with disbelief. "Is this really mine?" Maria nodded. "All yours, but you'll have to help with the dishes at the diner." That evening, Maria found Ben sitting cross-legged on his bed, carefully writing in a journal she had given him. He didn't try to hide it when he noticed her standing in the doorway. Instead, he turned it toward her with quiet solemnity, offering the page for her to read. In careful, deliberate handwriting, he had written, "Not everyone who feeds you is kind, but those who sit beside you when others walk away, they are the ones you call family." Maria's eyes blurred with tears she hadn't expected. Here was this child, who had lost so much, who had seen the worst of the world, and still managed to find a way to express kindness and wisdom beyond his years. He, who had endured so much pain and isolation, was teaching her about family, a word Maria had long since stopped using, especially after the loss of her husband. The following week, Maria had a new sign installed above the diner's entrance. The familiar words "Maple and Soul" remained, but now there was a smaller sign beneath it. "Ben's Table, for those who wait in silence." It was a subtle tribute to the quiet strength Ben had shown, to the strength she too had discovered in herself. Business at the diner flourished. The corner booth, always reserved, was rarely empty. Veterans came in with their children, widows found comfort in the stillness, and lonely souls found respite in the warmth of the diner. Everyone who entered seemed to leave something behind, whether it was a shared story, a moment of peace, or just a feeling of belonging. And in return, they carried something precious with them. Maria often thought to herself that the kindest places are sometimes built by those who once had nowhere to go, those who have been lost and found again. Maple and Soul was one of those places, a sanctuary not just for Maria and Ben, but for anyone who needed it. And so the diner continued to be a place of solace, not just for the quiet people who came through its doors, but for Maria herself, who had learned that sometimes even the heaviest burdens could be lifted simply by sitting beside someone who understands.